I'd always been a fan of remote getaways, the kind where the nearest neighbor is miles away, and the only sounds you hear are the wind rustling through trees and the occasional animal scurrying across the ground. It wasn't that I disliked people. It was just that I craved the silence, the peace, and the solitude that came with being completely isolated in the woods. So when I stumbled upon a cabin for rent on the outskirts of a national forest, I knew it was exactly what I needed. A few days in a rustic cabin, away from the noise of the city, would help me recharge. The drive to the cabin was long. I didn't mind it at first. There was something soothing about the empty road, the trees lining the path, and the gradually fading sounds of civilization as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The cabin was located off a dirt road, hidden among thick forests. The directions I had received were vague. Turn left at the old oak tree, right at the abandoned shed, but I had no trouble following them. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw it. The cabin. It wasn't large, but it was everything I had hoped for. The cabin stood alone in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. It looked like something straight out of a postcard, with a small porch, wooden beams, and a chimney puffing out a thin stream of smoke. I pulled up to the front door, grabbed my bag from the trunk, and stepped out. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of air that you can only find in the woods. I stood there for a moment, just taking in the scenery. The cabin was secluded, which meant complete privacy, but it also meant complete isolation. Once inside, I was immediately struck by how cozy the place was. There was a stone fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen with everything I would need to cook my meals, and a modest bedroom at the back with a large window that looked out into the forest. I didn't waste time. I unpacked my bag, started a fire in the fireplace, and set up for a relaxing evening. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner, read a book by the fire, and eventually went to bed. The wind howled outside, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and branches, but other than that, the night was peaceful. It was exactly what I had hoped for, but the next day, things started to feel off. It started with the strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The trees creaked, the ground groaned, and every now and then, something would crash in the underbrush outside. But as the day wore on, I began to hear things that didn't feel quite right. Little sounds, too rhythmic, too deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. A tapping on the windows, a shuffle of footsteps near the porch, a rustling that didn't match the usual forest noises. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or some other woodland creature. But then the sounds grew louder, more frequent, more insistent. It was like something or someone was out there watching me. The idea of an intruder didn't make sense. I was miles from the nearest town. The cabin was isolated. I kept my mind busy, trying not to dwell on the strange noises. I went for a walk through the woods, hoping the exercise would clear my head. The forest was beautiful, peaceful even, and for a moment, I forgot about the unsettling sounds I'd been hearing. But as I wandered deeper into the trees, I started to feel it again, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped, listening, and sure enough, I heard it, a soft, crunching noise coming from behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. The woods were still. No animals, no movement. I stood there for a moment trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just a branch breaking, or the wind pushing something across the forest floor. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the noises outside the cabin escalated. The knocking started, slow at first, like someone was tapping on the wooden walls of the cabin. It was quiet, almost like a whisper in the night, but enough to make my skin crawl. Then it came again, a sharp knock, followed by silence. I sat frozen in the darkness, listening intently, but nothing more happened. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal was brushing up against the cabin, or maybe the wind was knocking branches into the walls. But it didn't feel like that. The sounds were too deliberate, too intentional. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. A loud bang came from the front door, followed by a scraping sound. It was unmistakable, the sound of something or someone dragging against the wooden floor of the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. I saw nothing but the rain and shadows. No one. Nothing that could explain the sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The hours passed, and I spent most of the night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any signs of movement. The wind outside had died down, and the forest was eerily silent. But the fear of not knowing what was out there, not knowing what was causing these sounds, gnawed at me. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all, and my nerves were frayed. I decided I would leave. I couldn't take the fear anymore. But when I opened the door to pack my things, I froze. There, in the dirt just outside the door, was a set of footprints. Barefoot, they were fresh, just made. The prints led away from the cabin and into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. Should I follow them? Should I call for help? But I knew that the nearest phone was miles away, and I had no cell service. I was on my own. I decided to follow the tracks. The woods were dense, and the further I went, the more I felt the weight of the silence. The air seemed heavy, pressing down on me, making each step feel like a struggle. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, toward a small clearing. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A small, makeshift shelter, just a few branches and some tarps, sat in the center of the clearing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shelter someone from the elements. My heart began to race as I realized someone had been out here. Someone had been living here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. My breath was shallow, my mind racing with the possibilities. Who was out here? What did they want? I turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. A rustling behind me, a snapping of twigs. My heart stopped in my chest. I didn't wait to see who or what was behind me. I ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted back toward the cabin, the sounds of footsteps following close behind. I could hear them getting closer, feel the presence of something or someone pursuing me through the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and bolted it. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I wasn't safe anymore. I locked all the windows, pulled the curtains shut, and spent the rest of the day inside, trying to gather my thoughts. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't stop myself from shaking. That night, the knocking on the door didn't come. The footsteps outside the cabin didn't return. The silence was suffocating, but at least I was safe inside. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute, and when morning came, I packed my things, loaded up my car, and left the cabin without a second thought. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I didn't need to. The footprints, the shelter in the clearing, and the strange sounds outside the cabin were enough to tell me I was never meant to be there, and I wasn't going back. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a weekend retreat in the mountains. Just me, a small cabin, and the solitude of the forest. No distractions, no work emails, no buzzing phones, just peace and quiet. I'd been feeling worn down by the grind of daily life, and I needed to get away from it all. So when I found the listing for the cabin, tucked away in a remote part of the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The drive was long, really long. I'd been on the road for hours, following narrow, winding roads that seemed to get more and more isolated with every mile. At first, I thought I might have missed a turn, but then I saw the familiar sign for the cabin rental company, and it felt like a relief. I took a sharp right off the main road onto an even smaller dirt path which seemed to go on forever. The trees around me thickened, their branches stretching above, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and fresh, and I could feel the quiet pressing in on me. I passed a couple of other cabins on the way, but they were all spaced so far apart that they didn't seem like neighbors. They looked empty, unoccupied, and I wondered if anyone had ever stayed here before. Eventually, I came across the cabin. It wasn't large, but it was more than enough for one person. A modest, single-story wooden structure with a porch that overlooked a small creek running through the forest. The whole place felt rustic, but inviting. It was exactly what I needed: peaceful, quiet, and secluded. I parked my car in front of the cabin, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The air felt cooler than I expected, and there was a slight dampness to it that hinted at rain. The sky was overcast, and the smell of pine and wet earth lingered in the air. I could hear the gentle rush of water from the creek nearby, and the sound of birds chirping faintly in the distance. It was serene, eerily so, but I wasn't about to let that stop me from enjoying my break. The inside of the cabin was just as simple as I expected. A small kitchen, a cozy living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom at the far end. There were bookshelves filled with dusty old novels, and a table near the window that seemed perfect for writing or just looking out at the forest. Everything was clean, neat, and seemingly untouched by time. I made myself at home, unpacking my bag and settling into the cabin. I opened the windows to let in the cool air and fired up the stove to make some dinner. It was peaceful. I ate, relaxed by the fire, and after a while, the evening began to settle in. I could feel the day's exhaustion creeping up on me, but I didn't want to go to bed too early. Instead, I grabbed a blanket and curled up on the couch, the warmth from the fire keeping the chill at bay. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the night grew darker, the wind began to howl louder. The branches creaked and groaned in the gusts, and the rain started to fall in steady sheets. I sat there for a while, watching the rain streak down the windows, feeling completely at peace with the world. That was when I first heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind and rain. But then it came again, this time louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, pushing branches or something else against the cabin. But then the sound came again. A sharp knock, like someone was knocking on the back door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, unease crawling up my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had hit the door. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then the knocking came again. It was closer this time, as if someone was standing right outside. I walked toward the back door, my steps slow, cautious. I tried to look through the window next to it, but all I could see was the blur of rain and darkness. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the door, listening. The storm outside was only growing stronger. I thought about calling the rental company or even the police, but there was no service here, no way to reach anyone. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone be out here in this weather? The nearest town was miles away. I hadn't seen another soul on the drive-in. Then the knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. It was almost too quiet. I exhaled, thinking it might be over. But then I heard it again. This time, it was on the window next to the door, a soft tap that sent a chill through me. Someone was outside. I was sure of it now. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way through the cabin, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. But the place was empty. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked. Everything was secure. There was no one around. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just outside the cabin, didn't go away. I sat down by the fire, trying to calm myself. It had to be my imagination. Maybe it was the storm, the wind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I was alone out here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The night dragged on, and sleep refused to come. I sat there in the living room, staring at the fire, listening to the storm outside. Every creak of the cabin, every crackle from the fire, every gust of wind felt like it was building towards something. I couldn't escape the sense that something was out there, waiting. And then, as if on cue, the knocking returned. This time it was louder, more forceful. It sounded like someone was hammering at the door. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the flashlight again, but before I could move, the knocking stopped. I froze. For a moment, the world was completely silent. The storm outside had quieted, and all I could hear was my own breathing. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No more knocking, no more sounds. It wasn't until the morning light filtered in through the windows that I felt I could finally breathe again. The storm had passed, and the sun was starting to rise. I cautiously stepped outside, half expecting to find something strange waiting for me. But the forest was still, quiet. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. I stayed at the cabin for the rest of the weekend, though I didn't sleep a wink. Every little sound made me jump. Every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. The rest of the weekend passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. I packed up and left as soon as I could. The drive back was just as long as the drive in, but the entire time, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was all in my head, maybe it was the storm, maybe it was just the isolation. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of someone, waiting for me in the dark. And I'll never be able to shake the memory of the knocks on the door, the taps on the window, and the quiet, unsettling silence that followed. I had always dreamt of a secluded cabin in the woods, away from everything. No distractions, no noise, no people. Just me, nature, and the simple joys of solitude. I had been working too hard, always surrounded by the chaos of the city, and the idea of escaping to a cabin seemed like the perfect remedy. The brochure for the cabin was charming. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a stunning view of the surrounding forest. It was exactly what I needed. The trip to the cabin was a long one. I drove for hours through winding mountain roads, and the farther I went, the more remote everything became. My phone had no signal, and the GPS kept losing its connection. The trees were dense, and the road narrowed the deeper I went into the wilderness. It wasn't exactly the easiest drive, but the scenery was beautiful. I passed lakes and valleys, but the deeper I got, the more isolated I felt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin itself was tucked away at the edge of a dense forest. It wasn't much, just one story with a small porch and a few windows that looked out into the trees. It was a little older than I had expected, but it still had that rustic charm I was hoping for. The wood was weathered, the roof covered with a layer of moss, and the entire place had an aura of quiet abandonment about it. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The smell of wood and earth filled the air, and the interior was just as simple as I imagined. Wooden floors, a small kitchen, and a cozy sitting area. The fireplace was the centerpiece, and I made a mental note to get a fire started later. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a thick quilt folded neatly at the end of the bed. I unpacked some snacks, and decided to take a walk before the light completely disappeared. I stepped outside, taking in the crisp mountain air. The forest around the cabin was dense, and there was a quiet stillness that felt a little too thick. I wandered along a narrow trail that led into the woods. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt at peace, disconnected from the world. For a moment, everything felt perfect. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The trail I had been following seemed to disappear into a thicket of trees, and the light was quickly fading. I turned around, intending to head back to the cabin, but the trail seemed unfamiliar now, as if the woods had shifted. The shadows had deepened, and the trees felt closer, more pressing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're in them alone. But then I heard something. It was soft at first, almost like a rustling, but then it grew louder, a slow, steady crunching of leaves. Something moving through the forest, just out of sight. My heart started to race. I stopped in my tracks, trying to listen. The sound paused, then started again, closer this time. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I didn't know what it was, but whatever it was moving toward me. I tried to ignore the fear creeping up my spine, but the quietness of the forest only seemed to amplify the sound of whatever was approaching. I stepped back slowly, trying to make my way back to the cabin, but the noise didn't stop. I quickened my pace, but then I heard a snap of a twig, and I froze. The sound was too deliberate, too close. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I strained my ears, trying to listen, but all I could hear was my heartbeat in my ears. My eyes darted around, scanning the darkening woods, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I turned around and started walking faster, my boots crunching the leaves beneath me. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? The thought of being out here alone with something or someone lurking in the woods made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace again, almost breaking into a run, but something about the woods felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the thicket of trees and saw the cabin ahead. I felt a sense of relief flood over me as I made my way back to the porch. The door was still unlocked, and I quickly stepped inside, bolting it behind me. I stood in the center of the room, trying to catch my breath, the quiet of the cabin surrounding me once more. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I told myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. The woods can be unsettling, and I had probably heard an animal moving through the underbrush. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the noises in the woods. It was the sense of being watched, the sensation that I wasn't truly alone. I tried to distract myself. I cooked some dinner, ate slowly, and kept the fire going. But as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The air outside had turned colder, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows. The longer I sat in the cabin, the more aware I became of every little noise. Every creak of the floor, every pop from the fire, every gust of wind outside. It all seemed too loud, too noticeable. Couldn't sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and every time I closed my eyes, the sounds of the woods outside came rushing back. I kept hearing twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the same crunching noise I had heard earlier. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it was always there, always in the background. At some point, I decided to get up and check the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and moved through the rooms, checking the windows and the doors. Everything was locked. I even stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the woods with the beam of the flashlight. There was nothing there, no movement, no shadows. The trees were still, and the wind had died down. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was all in my head. I had come here to relax, to escape, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there in the dark, listening. I was just about to drift off when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something heavy moving outside the cabin, right outside the window. I held my breath, the sound growing louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and shined it toward the window. I saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, nothing at all. The noise stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, staring into the darkness. The sound had stopped, but the unease remained. My mind kept replaying the sounds of the night, the rustling, the crunching, the feeling of being followed. What had been out there? Why did it feel like something was waiting, watching, just outside my door? Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to leave. I packed my bags quickly, not wanting to spend another moment in that cabin. I stepped outside and looked around, but the woods were quiet, the air calm. It was as if nothing had happened. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lingering just out of sight. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. The woods behind me, dark and endless, seemed to close in. I didn't look back. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I knew I didn't want to stay long enough to find out. The isolation, the stillness, the strange feeling of being watched. Those are things that stick with you. I've been to cabins before, but nothing like that. I never returned to that place. The woods have their secrets, and some are best left untouched. I've always loved the idea of a secluded cabin in the woods, a place to disconnect from the noise of the world and just breathe. The kind of spot where you can sit by a fire and listen to the crackling wood, watch the stars without the interference of city lights, and let the wilderness surround you. That's why I decided to rent a cabin out in the mountains, far from any real civilization. It was the perfect getaway. The brochure for the place painted a peaceful picture. One room, a wood stove for heat, an old but solid structure with plenty of space around it. The kind of place where you could just be. I drove up alone. My plan was simple. Stay for a weekend, enjoy the solitude, maybe do some hiking, a little fishing if I felt like it. The drive there was long, winding through narrow mountain roads, with sharp turns that made my tires scrape the gravel. The landscape changed as I drove higher. Thicker trees, quieter roads, the feeling of being cut off from everything. The air was fresh, crisp, the kind of air that feels new to your lungs. When I arrived, it was already late afternoon. The sky tinged orange from the setting sun. The cabin sat quietly at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by tall pines and wild undergrowth. It looked exactly like the pictures, old but well-maintained, a single-story structure with a porch that overlooked a small creek. The kind of place you see in movies when the character needs to escape from everything. I unloaded my bags from the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The place seemed peaceful, the only sounds being the breeze moving through the trees and the occasional bird calling from afar. It was just the kind of retreat I was hoping for. I could already feel the weight of the world slipping off my shoulders. The inside of the cabin was just as I'd imagined. Wooden floors, a small stone fireplace, and a rustic kitchen with a propane stove. The furniture was worn, but it was the kind of worn that felt welcoming, familiar. The bed was simple, with a thick quilt folded neatly at the foot. I made myself a quick meal, nothing fancy, just some pasta with sauce, and sat by the fire for a while. The flame from the fire was warm and comforting, and the smell of the burning wood filled the cabin. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, the air turning colder. I wrapped myself in a thick sweater and settled on the couch, my legs stretched out. I had no particular plans other than to read a book I'd brought with me. But as I sat there, the isolation started to settle in. The silence was deafening, and though I had come here for solitude, there was something unsettling about the stillness, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. The fire crackled, breaking the silence for a moment. But when the crackling died down, I was left with only the sound of the wind outside, brushing through the trees. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that crept into my mind, reminding myself that it was just the isolation, the kind of quiet that takes getting used to. I stood up and made my way to the window, looking out over the small creek and the stretch of forest beyond. That's when I noticed something, a shadow. It was hard to make out, just a figure standing at the edge of the woods, near the tree line. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the result of too much silence and too little company. But as I stared, I realized that it wasn't moving. It was standing still, watching the cabin, or at least it felt like it was. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a bear, though I hadn't heard anything rustling outside. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I became. The shadow didn't seem to have a natural shape, just a tall, dark form against the trees. I stepped back from the window, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. I checked the front porch, then the back porch, but there was nothing there. I turned off the lights, grabbed my flashlight, and cautiously stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharper than it had been when I arrived. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but I saw nothing. No shape, no movement, just the dark expanse of trees. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves, but everything felt wrong. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the unsettling feeling growing stronger. Still, I convinced myself that I had just imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or the shadows from the trees, and I was just spooked from being alone for too long. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down by the fire again. I tried to focus on my book, but the sound of the wind outside was starting to get louder, more insistent, like the forest was trying to communicate something. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The wind howled through the trees as the night deepened, and I began to hear something. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks again, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The steps were coming closer now, moving toward the front of the cabin. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door. My breath was shallow, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was no one there, no shadow, no movement, but the footsteps continued. Now they were behind the cabin, slowly circling. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the flashlight again, turning it on and off in quick flashes, hoping to illuminate whatever was out there. But nothing, no movement. The sound of the footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. I stayed by the window, watching the dark shape of the trees, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I finally sat back down. I was so tense, my body coiled with fear, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, suddenly, I heard something else. A knock, light, deliberate, and coming from the back of the cabin. I jumped up and moved toward the door, my mind a blur. There was no way I could just ignore it. My hand was shaking as I reached for the door handle, my breath coming faster now. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged along the wooden surface of the cabin. My heart raced. I couldn't stand it anymore. I moved to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter, trying to steady my breath. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. The knocking stopped, but the scraping continued, moving slowly around the back of the cabin. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to hear any other sounds. There was nothing but the wind and that scraping sound, almost rhythmic now. It felt like it was circling me, inching closer to the door. Finally, the scraping stopped, and there was a long silence. I waited, my body trembling, my eyes fixed on the door, the flashlight flickering in my hand. The silence felt thick, suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound was gone. The footsteps, the scraping, the knocking, all of it disappeared. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't wait any longer to find out what it was, what it wanted. I grabbed my things, rushed to the car, and sped down the mountain road, not once looking back. I never returned to that cabin. It was a place I had wanted to escape to be alone with my thoughts. But I came to realize that some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, are better left unexplored. I couldn't explain what happened that night, nor could I explain the feeling that I had been watched by something or someone. The woods are vast, and they hold many secrets, some of which are best left alone. I booked the cabin in late September, right after I finished a rough stretch of work. I was burned out and needed somewhere quiet, away from everything. I didn't want a resort or anything crowded or too polished. I wanted a real break, something isolated and basic. I found the listing online. It was a simple wooden cabin in northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest gas station was over 30 minutes away. It was advertised as rustic and off-grid, which was exactly what I wanted. The pictures showed a small one-room place with a wood stove, a single bed, and a kitchen with an old propane stove and a metal sink that drained into a barrel outside. There was an outhouse about 30 feet behind it. No neighbors for miles, just forest and hills and a lake a short walk down a narrow path. I drove up in my old pickup and got there late in the afternoon. It was cold for September, with the kind of wind that cuts through even a thick sweatshirt. The road leading to the cabin was just a single lane of dirt that wound through thick pines. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches out of the way. There were no signs, and I had to backtrack once after missing a turn. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky. The cabin looked smaller in person, a gray little structure with a steep tin roof and a short porch. There was an old oil drum beside the porch and a pile of firewood under a tarp. I parked beside it, got out and stretched. It was quiet in a way you don't usually get anymore. No humming power lines, no distant cars, just trees moving in the wind. I unlocked the cabin with the key the owner had mailed me and stepped inside. The smell hit me right away, dry wood, old smoke, and dust. The place was simple, exactly as described. The bed was against the far wall with a thick wool blanket folded at the foot. There was a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of canned food, a tiny sink, and the stove. A stack of newspapers was in the corner, probably to help light fires. There was a single window above the sink and another on the side wall, both with old curtains hanging halfway. I carried in my supplies, mostly canned stuff, some dry food, water jugs, a hatchet, a lantern, extra batteries, and a big first aid kit. I had a rifle too, more out of habit than fear. I'd been in enough remote places to know that you can't always count on help arriving quickly, or at all. I got the fire going in the stove and unpacked. After heating some soup on the propane stove, I sat on the porch and watched the light fade. The woods were turning gold and orange, with just enough green left to show summer hadn't fully let go. Birds chirped here and there. I could hear the lake faintly if I focused, water lapping the shore and rustling reeds. I stayed out there until it got too cold, then went inside, fed the fire, and turned in early. The first night passed quietly. The wind blew harder after dark, and I could hear it pressing against the cabin, making the tin roof creak now and then. But I slept pretty well. I woke once around 2 a.m. to use the outhouse, and the air outside was freezing. My breath came out in clouds, and I had the strange feeling of being watched, which I wrote off as nerves and the darkness. The next couple of days settled into a rhythm. I chopped firewood, walked down to the lake, did some reading, and sat on the porch for long stretches, just watching the woods. I didn't see any deer or bear, but there were tracks near the lake. Big ones, probably moose or maybe elk. I wasn't sure. I kept the fire going and slept soundly, though I did start hearing things at night. Not animals exactly, more like sticks breaking, quick footfalls in the leaves, and once what sounded like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was probably raccoons or squirrels or maybe a porcupine. The wind played tricks out there. Still, I started keeping the rifle closer to the bed. On the 4th day, things started to feel off. I was down at the lake, sitting on a rock, when I noticed something across the water. The far side of the lake was thick with trees, and I hadn't thought anyone else was out here. But I saw something white among the trunks. Not moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out a shape, and it was gone when I looked back after a blink. Probably a birch tree or a trick of the light. But I felt uneasy the rest of the walk back. That night, the fire burned too fast. I had to get up twice to feed it, and each time I looked out the window, I felt like something had changed, like something had been moved outside. The firewood stack seemed shorter. The metal bucket beside the door wasn't where I'd left it. I wasn't sure. Maybe I was just tired, or my mind was playing tricks. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found footprints, human ones, not boots, bare feet. They started near the edge of the clearing, moved to the porch, then disappeared behind the cabin. The ground was cold and hard, and the prints were faint, but they were there, too big to be a child. The toes were splayed wide, and the heels dug deep. It didn't make sense. No one would be out here barefoot, not this far from anything. Not in this weather. I walked a wide circle around the clearing with the rifle. No sign of anyone. No sounds either. The forest was still. I didn't see more prints after that, and I tried to tell myself they'd been there since before I arrived. I hadn't checked that carefully the first day, but that didn't explain the ones by the porch. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, straining to hear anything over the wind. At some point, I heard movement again. Not an animal. Too slow, too deliberate. Something brushing against the cabin again. I grabbed the rifle and sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I waited, not breathing. Then I heard something near the outhouse. A creak like the door moving. I stayed inside, rifle in my lap, staring at the door until the sun came up. I went out as soon as it was light. The outhouse door was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. I walked over slowly, rifle up, every part of me tense. The inside was empty, nothing disturbed. I looked around and saw more of those footprints, this time in the soft dirt behind the outhouse. They led into the woods and disappeared. That was when I made the decision to leave. It wasn't fear exactly, not panic. It was something deeper, instinct. Something wasn't right out there. It wasn't just isolation anymore. Someone was nearby, and they weren't trying to be seen. I packed my gear quickly, loading it all back into the truck. I left some of the heavier stuff behind, extra firewood, a folding chair, just to speed things up. As I slammed the tailgate shut and turned to go inside for the last bag, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Just for a second. Person. Bare-chested. Pale. Gone before I could focus. They didn't run. They just stepped back into the trees, slow and silent. I didn't go back inside. I left the last bag, clothes mostly, and got in the truck. I turned the key. The engine turned once, then clicked. Dead. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach dropped. I checked under the hood. The battery cables were loose. Not frayed, not chewed. Loosened. Deliberately. I tightened them by hand, heart hammering, watching the woods. I tried again. The engine turned, stuttered, then caught. I threw it into reverse and backed out fast, almost hitting a stump. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles from the cabin. I didn't see anything else on the way out. I didn't report it. What would I say? That someone had been lurking near the cabin? That I saw a figure in the woods? That someone had messed with my truck? No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. It felt like something that didn't belong in words. Anyway, it's been almost a year since that trip. I haven't gone back. I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone or when it gets quiet in the evening. I'll be sitting in my house, and I'll remember the way those bare footprints looked, or the face I didn't quite see at the tree line. I'll remember the outhouse door creaking at 2 a.m, or the white shape across the lake that vanished when I blinked. It wasn't a ghost or a monster or anything like that. It was real. Someone was out there, living in those woods, watching, waiting, maybe just curious, maybe worse. They didn't try to speak or approach. They didn't threaten me or show a weapon. But they didn't have to. That kind of silence says enough. I've never liked talking about what happened during that week up at the cabin. It's not the kind of story that people believe, and it's not dramatic in the way most scary stories are. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no flashing lights in the sky. Just a series of things that felt off, then more off until it became something I couldn't explain away. And the worst part of it all is that it wasn't a dream, it wasn't a movie. It was just real, plain and cold and quiet. It started in late October. I'd taken a few weeks off from work after finishing a job site cleanup in the suburbs of Minneapolis. I was tired and wanted space. I don't do well in cities. I never have. I like to be out of the way, far from traffic, noise, or people. I like places where your thoughts are the only sounds you hear. So when my cousin asked if I wanted to use an old cabin he owned for a while, I said yes without thinking twice. He told me it hadn't been used in years, said it sat about 40 minutes from the nearest paved road, deep into a patch of wooded land near an old stone quarry in northern Wisconsin. The quarry wasn't active anymore. The company that owned it shut down in the 90s, and the forest grew back around it. There were cliffs, water pits, and a few broken down structures where the rock used to be hauled out. I figured it would be quiet. The cabin was one of those old 1960s single-room builds. Just a rectangle with a sloped roof, wooden siding, and a rusted stovepipe sticking out the top. No power, no plumbing, just a pump out back and a small outhouse down a short path. I brought food, a camp stove, a few jugs of water, and all my gear in the back of my truck. I also packed my rifle, not because I planned to hunt, but because it felt like the right thing to have way out there. You never know with coyotes or the occasional black bear, and I like being ready. The drive-in was rough. The old logging road that led to the cabin had been chewed up by years of weather. Fallen branches, muddy dips, and stretches of tall grass made it a slow crawl. I had to stop more than once to clear debris and keep the tires from slipping. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was already getting low, and the clearing around the structure was shaded in long, cold shadows. The grass came up to my knees in places. The front steps sagged a little under my boots. Still, the place didn't look too bad. The roof was intact. No signs of animals getting in. The windows were dirty, but not broken. I walked around the perimeter, checked the door, then pushed it open. The air inside smelled like wood rot and dust. A few spider webs hung in the corners. The cot along the far wall was intact but dusty. There was a metal stove in the center with a small pile of chopped wood next to it. I could see mouse droppings on the shelf near some old canned goods, so I cleared that off and started fresh. It didn't take long to settle in. I swept out the worst of the dirt, stacked my supplies, and unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot. I got a small fire going in the stove for warmth, then stepped back out to watch the last bit of light fade through the trees. That night was quiet. I sat on the porch for a long time listening to nothing. Just wind through the trees, the occasional crack of a twig in the distance, and the dry rustle of leaves blowing over the clearing. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. When I went back inside, I locked the door out of habit, even though it wouldn't keep out much more than a raccoon. Still, I felt safe. I woke up around 2 in the morning, not sure why. It wasn't a noise that woke me. I didn't hear anything. It was just one of those sudden wake-ups, like when your body knows something you don't. I sat up in the dark and listened. The fire had died to a low glow. I could hear wind again, a little stronger now, and the faint creaking of the walls. Nothing else. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling for a while until sleep came back. The next few days passed the same way. I hiked around, explored the nearby quarry, and gathered firewood. The quarry itself was huge, maybe the size of a football field, with steep rock walls on 3 sides and a shallow, stagnant water pit at the bottom. There were crumbling remains of old equipment, rusted metal frames, and broken ladders lying in weeds. The place was eerie, even during the day. It felt abandoned in the heaviest sense of the word. I never stayed long. One morning, I found tracks near the cabin. At first, I thought they were deer, but something about them felt off. They were too wide, and the spacing was strange. I followed them for a while, but they weaved in a way that didn't make sense. Not a straight path, just zigzags and circles that led nowhere. I chalked it up to a wandering animal and let it go. The next night, I had trouble sleeping again. This time, it wasn't just a feeling. I heard something outside, a crunch, then another, slow steps through the grass. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the rifle. I didn't turn on the flashlight right away. I just listened. The steps circled the cabin once. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I finally got up and opened the door. Cold air hit me hard, but I stepped out. The moon was half full, enough to see shapes. The clearing looked the same. No movement, but the air felt thick, like something was just beyond the tree line watching. I stood there for 10 minutes before going back in. I kept the rifle next to me that night. In the morning, I looked for tracks again. I found them this time. Deep prints in the soft ground, the same strange shape and spacing as before. They came right up to the window, then looped around back. I followed them toward the trees, but they vanished after about 20 yards, like whoever or whatever left them had walked backward in their own steps. It made no sense. That was the first day I thought about leaving. I packed some of my things, loaded the truck bed, but something in me didn't want to rush. Maybe pride, maybe curiosity. I stayed one more night. That evening, just before sunset, I went down to the quarry. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see it one last time, to prove to myself that everything was normal. The light was low, casting long shadows over the rocks. I walked along the edge, kicking small stones and watching them fall. Then I saw something. On the far side of the pit, across the water, I spotted a shape near one of the crumbled structures. At first, I thought it was part of the building, a post or broken pipe, but then it moved. Just a shift, like someone leaning. I froze. The shape was tall, too tall. It didn't move like a person. It stayed crouched, half hidden. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of something big and quiet and watching. I backed away, step by step, never taking my eyes off that spot. Whatever it was didn't follow. I walked the whole way back to the cabin without looking behind me. Once inside, I locked the door, stacked furniture against it, and didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, ears straining for every sound. That night was the longest of my life. I heard movement again, but not footsteps this time. It was like dragging, like something pulling itself over the ground. Then a knock, soft, deliberate, on the far wall. Then nothing. At first light, I grabbed everything and left. I didn't pack right. I didn't check the map. I just drove. The truck bounced and slid over the muddy road, but I didn't stop. Not until I hit the pavement and saw the first sign of a mailbox. I told my cousin not to offer the cabin to anyone else. He asked if something happened. I just told him it wasn't safe. Weeks later, I looked up old articles about the quarry. Turns out a drifter had gone missing near that area in the late 90s. They never found a body. Locals said the quarry was bad land. Not cursed, not haunted, just wrong. Things lived out there, animals maybe, people maybe, that didn't want to be found. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because I'm scared of what I saw, but because I don't know what I didn't see. And because some places don't want visitors. Not now, not ever, and they'll make sure you know it.